Hi, my dear friend. How's your heart today? Rain falls softly over Seattle. A woman stands by her window, a cup trembling in her hands. The envelope on the table glints under the light her son's wedding invitation. But where her name should be, there's only a line that reads to the family of the late George Whitmore. She stares frozen as the sound of the sink fades into silence. Years of sacrifice erased by one missing name, her voice low and steady. They called it a small ceremony, only close family. But I was the one who raised him alone. Cut to the cup, slipping, shattering on the floor. Coffee spreading like ink. Voice softens. People don't have to shout to hurt you. Sometimes all it takes is forgetting to call your name. The rain in Seattle had that quiet rhythm that fills every corner of a house soft but relentless. I was rinsing out my coffee mug when I heard the mail slot creak. The envelope slid onto the rug by the door, creamy white with gold lettering. My name wasn't on it, just the neat embossed line that read, "To the family of the late George Whitmore." For a moment I just stood there, the sink still running, the sound of water steady behind me. I turned off the faucet and wiped my hands on a towel. The handwriting was too neat to be Ethan's. I opened the envelope carefully, not sure why my hands were trembling. Inside was a wedding invitation. My son's wedding. The paper smelled faintly of perfume, something floral and expensive. Ethan Whitmore and Vanessa Reed request the honor of your presence at their marriage. The date was next month. The venue was a vineyard in eastern Washington. My eyes stopped at the salutation again. It didn't say Mom. It didn't even say Helen. Only family of the late George Whitmore, as if I existed only as a shadow of my dead husband. For a long minute I just sat on the couch holding that invitation. The room was quiet except for the ticking clock. I thought of the years I'd spent raising Ethan alone after George died. The late nights balancing hospital ledgers, the dinners reheated 3 times, waiting for him to come home from college. And now apparently I wasn't family enough to be named. I picked up my phone. My fingers hesitated over his contact, then pressed call. The ring dragged on until a woman's voice answered. "Helen, hi, it's Vanessa." I recognized the smooth tone immediately. Polite practiced. "Hi, Vanessa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just got your invitation. I noticed my name wasn't—" "We're keeping it intimate," she said, lightly cutting me off. "Just close family. You understand, right? It's going to be a small ceremony, just a few people we're really close to." Before I could answer, I heard Ethan in the background say something muffled. Vanessa laughed softly, the kind of laugh that didn't include me. "Could I speak to Ethan for a moment?" I asked. "He's right here," she said. There was a pause, then her voice again, smooth as glass. "We really have to go, Helen. I'll make sure he calls you later, okay?" The line went dead. I sat there listening to the silence that followed the hum of the refrigerator, the patter of rain against the window. My hands felt cold. I told myself maybe it was an oversight. Maybe they'd printed one version of the invitation and mine just happened to be wrong. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a mistake. Vanessa didn't do mistakes. She curated everything, even people. That night I made a simple dinner and turned on the lamp in the living room. The house felt too big, the shadows too long. I poured a cup of tea, then set it down untouched on the coffee table. Out of habit, I checked Ethan's social media. His profile picture was the same, his arm around Vanessa, both smiling perfectly for the camera. Scrolling down, a new post appeared, a pre-wedding photo shoot. Vanessa in a long silk dress framed by vines and fairy lights. Her parents stood beside her, both beaming. And there was Ethan, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on her shoulder. Underneath his caption read, "The family I always dreamed of." The cup slipped from my hand before I realized it. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, coffee spreading across the tile, the handle breaking clean off. I crouched to pick it up, watching the brown liquid trace tiny rivers across the grout. A single hairline fracture ran through the cup from rim to base. I pressed my thumb over it and whispered almost to myself, "I guess dreams have room for new people, but not for the ones who made them possible." Outside, the rain picked up again, tapping against the window pane like it wanted to be heard. I sat back on the floor, leaning against the cabinet, the broken cup still in my hand. The air smelled faintly of coffee and damp earth. I thought of George then. He would have handled this differently, maybe with more patience, maybe with humor. But he wasn't here. I had done this part alone, every late bill, every loan, every holiday dinner for one. Somewhere deep down something shifted. It wasn't anger yet, not even sadness, just a hollow understanding that the space I'd carved out in their lives had quietly been filled by someone else. I washed the cup pieces, dried them, and placed them back together on the counter, the crack like a thin scar down the side. When I turned off the light, the house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. I stood by the window and watched the streetlights reflect on wet pavement. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered, but there was a steadiness in her eyes I hadn't noticed before. People don't have to shout to hurt you. Sometimes all it takes is forgetting to call your name. I pulled the curtain closed and sat down, the invitation still on the table beside me, its gold letters catching the lamplight. For a moment, I imagined tearing it in half. Instead, I slid it back into the envelope, smoothed the flap, and tucked it into the drawer under my bills. It belonged there among things that had once mattered and now didn't. The rain eased, and the silence that followed was almost gentle. I finished my tea, cold, washed the dishes, and turned off the kitchen light. The hum of the city outside felt distant, softened by the drizzle. I told myself tomorrow I'd decide what to do next. But tonight, I would let the quiet stay. Morning came gray and soft, the kind of Seattle light that makes everything look half asleep. I made coffee, rinsed the cracked cup, and opened the blue ledger I had kept since George died. The pages smelled faintly of paper and ink. 4 years of transfers stared back at me. Tuition, car repairs, apartment deposits, grocery runs, $62,000 in total. I touched the number as if it could change. I used to believe kindness was an investment that always paid back. Now the balance sheet told another story. I remembered Vanessa's early messages calling me the best promising visits that never came. Ethan's excuses saying she was under pressure, that I shouldn't take it personally. I had believed him. I always did. My phone buzzed on the counter. A new message from Vanessa. She wrote that the market was hot, that they were short on their down payment, that $10,000 would make all of the difference. Just this one time, she added, followed by a heart. I set the phone face down and stared at the rain streaking down the window. Gratitude, I thought, should be more than punctuation. When I turned the phone over again, I opened Ethan's thread. The last message from him was weeks old. A quick note saying he'd call soon. He hadn't. I typed, then erased, then typed again. Kindness isn't a subscription. It expires when there's no gratitude. I read it once, then deleted it. I didn't owe them another explanation. My thumb hovered over her contact. The word block sat at the bottom of the screen, small and clear. For a moment, I thought of every transfer, every night I waited for a call, every time I defended them to friends who said I was too generous. Then I pressed it. The soft click sounded louder than it should have. I closed the ledger and slid it into the drawer. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the fridge. I poured the rest of my coffee into the sink and rinsed the cup again, tracing the crack with my thumb. It hadn't broken completely. It was still whole enough to use. By noon, I had written a small list on a sticky note: visit the bank update authorizations, add Grace as trusted contact. I pressed it to the fridge door. Outside, the rain slowed to a mist. I stood at the window watching drops collect on the glass until they fell. People always say freedom is doing what you want. Maybe sometimes it's just deciding what you won't do anymore. The house was still. My phone lay silent. Somewhere far across town, life went on. I took a breath and let the quiet settle in. The only sound left was that tiny click still echoing inside me, sharp and final. By the next morning, the decision had settled in me like steady ground after a long tremor. I woke early, dressed in the navy coat I used to wear to the office, and drove toward downtown. The streets were slick with drizzle, the kind that never really stopped in Seattle, but softened just enough to let people move. North River Credit Union sat on the corner of 8th and Pine, the same building where I had spent half my life balancing numbers that were never mine. The lobby smelled of carpet cleaner and brewed coffee. The new posters talked about family savings and trust. I almost laughed. Behind the counter, a young teller greeted me and asked if I needed assistance. I told her I was here to see Fred Cho, the branch manager. Her name tag said Mia, and she looked at me with that polite uncertainty of someone who can't tell if you're a stranger or a story her boss once told. She called upstairs. A few minutes later, Fred appeared, still broad-shouldered, a little grayer, but his grin exactly the same. "Helen Whitmore," he said, shaking his head as if he didn't quite believe it. "I haven't seen you since you retired. What brings you back here?" It took a second to answer. Habit made me want to smile and say just catching up, but that would have been a lie. I said I needed to make some account changes. Serious ones. He gestured toward his office. The glass walls reflected rows of computers and the blurred movement of customers. I sat down opposite his desk, the same spot where I had trained him 25 years ago when he was still learning how to reconcile a statement. I explained what I needed. Close the joint savings account. Remove any online access associated with Ethan's name. Block external transfers to his profile. Activate a fraud alert on all accounts. And I wanted to add a trusted contact, my neighbor, Grace Coleman. Fred typed as I spoke, his fingers slower than I remembered, but still careful. He looked up halfway through. "He is your son, right? Yes. You're sure you want to do this?" "I am." He leaned back slightly, his voice quieter. "We get a few cases like this now and then, families mixing finances. Sometimes it gets messy." "It already is," I said. "I'm just cleaning up the rest." Fred studied me for a moment and nodded. "All right, Helen. I'll walk you through everything so there are no gaps." He turned the monitor toward me and scrolled through the account details. My name, the balance, the recurring payments. Ethan's name sat below mine on the old joint account, a digital ghost of a decision I barely remembered making. Fred printed a form and slid it across the desk. "You'll need to sign here, here, and again at the bottom. Once these are processed, he won't have access to your funds." I took the pen and signed each line neat and slow, the way I always taught others to do. My signature hadn't changed since the first day I started working there in 1994. When I finished, Fred hesitated. "Do you want to leave the account open for transfers from him in case he ever, no, I said before he could finish. If he wants to send something, he can call first." Fred nodded again, professional but kind. He added Grace's information as a secondary contact and printed a confirmation sheet. "You should also know we have a fraud prevention team. If anyone tries to reopen access, they'll call you directly." "Good." He glanced at me again, maybe searching for the softer version of the woman who used to bring donuts on Fridays. I could tell he wanted to say something comforting, something about family, but he didn't. Instead, he stood and offered his hand. "I'm glad you came in today. Too many people wait until it's too late." The handshake was firm, respectful. I thanked him and walked out to the lobby. As I reached the glass doors, my phone started buzzing in my purse. I didn't need to look to know who it was. The vibration came in quick bursts, one after another, as if urgency could undo paperwork. I stepped outside into the drizzle and took a breath. Across the street, traffic hummed. A woman pushed a stroller past a flower stand, and the air smelled faintly of wet soil and tulips. The phone kept vibrating. When it stopped, a text appeared. "Mom, what's going on? Vanessa says your accounts are showing restrictions. Are you okay?" Another buzz. "Why would you do that?" And another. "We just needed a few weeks. You didn't have to make it weird." I didn't respond. I turned the phone to silent and slipped it back into my pocket. My reflection looked back at me from the glass wall of the building, a little older, smaller than the person I used to be, but still upright. Inside, Fred was talking to a customer. He looked up briefly, caught my eye, and gave a small nod. I nodded back. I started walking toward the parking lot, my shoes clicking against the pavement. Each step felt measured, like counting backward from something that had already ended. At the car, I sat for a while before starting the engine. The rain traced slow lines down the windshield. Ethan's name flashed again on the screen this time with a voicemail notification. I didn't play it. I didn't need to hear another voice telling me what I already knew. I remembered what Fred had said once when we were auditing a messy account years ago. If the numbers don't add up, stop arguing with them. The math isn't lying. It's the story behind it that is. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel. They still trembled a little from signing so many times. I thought of the checklists waiting at home, the sticky note on the fridge, the list of changes I had promised myself to finish. A car honked behind me, pulling me back to the moment. I started the engine and merged into traffic, the city moving slow under a low gray sky. At a red light, I caught my reflection again in the rearview mirror. The woman there looked tired but clear-eyed, the kind of tired that comes after doing the right thing, not the easy one. When I reached home, I parked and sat for another minute before getting out. The rain had softened to mist again, brushing against my coat as I walked up the path. The lights from my apartment window flickered faintly through the damp air. Inside, the phone was still buzzing on the counter, another message lighting the screen. I let it ring until it stopped. Then I set it face down, turned to the window, and watched the raindrops gather and slide down the glass in straight, certain lines. Keeping the line straight had always been what I did best. The sky darkened early that afternoon, the kind of Seattle gray that made 4 o'clock feel like night. I was standing at the counter, pouring hot water through the filter, the smell of coffee drifting into the quiet, when a sudden knock hit the door, followed by the handle turning before I could answer. Ethan stepped inside his coat, still wet from the rain, Vanessa right behind him in her beige trench and sharp expression, and a man I didn't know trailing close behind. The man smiled with a kind of professional ease that made my stomach tighten. "Mom," Ethan began, his voice uneasy. "This is Vanessa's brother, Julian. He's been helping us with some financial planning." Julian reached out his hand, confident, polished. "Helen, it's good to meet you. I've heard a lot about how organized you are with your finances." I didn't shake his hand. My cup was still half full, and the air between us already smelled like something rehearsed. Vanessa took off her coat, folded it neatly, and placed it over the chair by the table. The move was too casual for a surprise visit. Julian opened a leather folder and spread out several sheets of paper, anchoring the corners with a pen and a small calculator. "We just wanted to make sure everything was secure for you," he said, voice smooth, patient. "It's a simple document, a durable power of attorney. It'll protect your accounts if anything ever happens." The words landed like cold rain. I looked at Ethan. He couldn't meet my eyes. "You didn't call," I said quietly. "You just came." He rubbed the back of his neck. Vanessa thought it would be easier to explain in person. Julian slid the papers an inch closer. "It's really straightforward," he continued. "You just sign here and Ethan can handle everything if you're ever unable to. It's standard practice for seniors." My head lifted at that word, seniors. I repeated it not loud but sharp enough that he stopped talking. I leaned forward and read the top line of the page, durable power of attorney. The text below blurred for a moment, but the words I could see were enough. Authority, accounts, property, decision, all of it. Vanessa perched on the edge of the chair, her tone careful. "We just want to help Helen. You've been under a lot of stress with the banking stuff, and Ethan's worried about you managing a loan." I put my cup down. "You mean the account I closed last week? The one you two shouldn't have had access to in the first place?" Vanessa's eyes flashed before she caught herself. "Mom, she said we're just trying to make sure you're protected." Julian's smile didn't fade. He pushed the paper again. "It only takes a signature. You can even revoke it later if you want." I walked to the sideboard and picked up my phone, angling it toward them casually. As I opened the camera app, my thumb pressed record. "You know I said still calm. I spent 25 years auditing for the hospital system. Numbers, signatures, authorization codes. I can read faster than most people can explain their lies." Julian's face froze for the briefest second. He reached forward, maybe to collect the papers, maybe to steady his composure. Ethan finally spoke. "Mom, please. We just thought this would be easier than what I asked. Than trusting me to understand my own money." Vanessa exhaled, standing up. "This is ridiculous. We're wasting time." Julian straightened the stack. "Helen," he said in that careful voice again, "no one is forcing you. We're only advising." I cut him off. "Anyone who pressures an older woman to sign a financial document without full consent ends up talking to the police." The room went quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Rain beat against the window in fast, uneven bursts. Vanessa's cheeks flushed red. "Fine," she snapped, grabbing her coat. "Do what you want, but don't call us when something goes wrong." She stormed toward the door heels, striking the floor hard. Julian followed, muttering something under his breath about good intentions. Ethan lingered, standing between the kitchen and the hallway. He looked like a boy again, unsure of which side he belonged to. His hands opened and closed as if words might come through them. I didn't say anything. I just met his eyes long enough for him to look down. After a few seconds, he nodded, once turned and followed them out into the rain. The door shut with a hollow sound. I stood there for a long time, the camera still recording in my hand, the red light blinking like a heartbeat. The smell of coffee had turned bitter, left too long on the burner. I turned it off and poured the rest down the sink. Outside, car doors slammed and an engine started. Their voices blurred under the rain, then disappeared. I locked the door and checked it twice. My breath came slow, deep, controlled. I leaned against the wall, feeling the weight leave my shoulders little by little. The apartment was still almost too still. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, the hum of the heater kicking on. On the counter, one of the papers Julian had dropped fluttered slightly in the breeze from the vent. I walked over and picked it up. At the bottom was a line labeled for signature, the ink dotted where the pen had touched once, probably when he tried to steady it. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into a folder with my bills, evidence if I ever needed it. The window pane fogged from the warmth of the room. My reflection stared back faint and pale against the glass. The rain behind it looked like strands of silver thread running down a sheet of gray. There was anger somewhere in me, but it was quiet, measured, the kind that didn't need to prove anything. I breathed it in, let it settle. Silence can hold power when you let it. I turned off the kitchen light and walked to the living room, pausing at the door. The lock clicked softly as it set in place, a sound that echoed just enough to fill the space. I leaned back against the wall, closed my eyes, and felt the room steady around me. Some silences are stronger than any shout. Morning light slipped through the blinds and spilled across the kitchen floor. The coffee maker clicked on automatically, its familiar hum filling the silence. I stood by the window looking out at the small backyard that George and I had once tended together. The lavender sat there faded and thin from years of neglect, its purple long gone to gray. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the air damp and clean. I took the garden shears from the drawer by the sink and stepped outside. The soil gave a soft sound under my shoes. For a long moment I simply stood over the plant. The stems were brittle, the leaves dusted with the remnants of last season. I bent down, touched one, and felt it crumble slightly between my fingers. The scent was faint but familiar, like an old memory you cannot quite let go of. When I began to cut, the sound was crisp and small, like paper tearing. I worked slowly, stacking the dead stems in a neat pile. With each snip, I felt the quiet shift inside me, not sadness exactly, but a kind of resolve. Behind me, a voice called from the fence. "Morning, Helen." I turned. Grace Coleman was standing there in her red jacket holding a cup of tea. Her silver hair was tied back loosely, and her dog Baxter sat obediently at her feet. "You're out early," she said, her tone gentle but curious. "Habit," I told her, wiping my gloves on my jeans. The lavender needed cutting anyway. She stepped closer, peering over the fence. "George planted those, didn't he? I remember he said the scent helped him sleep." "He did," I said, and it did. Grace frowned slightly. "Why cut them now? They'll grow back if you just trim the tops." I clipped another stem and looked up at her because I want them to bloom for now, not for a memory. She watched me for a moment, then smiled, the kind that understands more than it says. "That's fair. Most people let things linger too long." We sat on the bench by the fence while Baxter wandered off to chase something invisible. Grace took a sip of tea, then looked at me. "I saw your porch light on late last night. Everything okay?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Just family things." She made a small sound that could have been sympathy or recognition. "Family things," she repeated, as if the phrase was a language we both spoke fluently. After a quiet pause, she said, I volunteer with a group called the Silver Harbor Network. It's mostly women our age, widows or retirees who've had, let's say, complicated experiences with money and family. We help each other understand our rights, legal protections, that sort of thing. It's not therapy, but it helps." I kept my eyes on the lavender. "What do you mean by complicated experiences?" She smiled faintly. "Oh, adult children making decisions for us. People who think a retirement check is a family asset. A few of us got tricked into signing things we didn't understand. We share stories and learn how to prevent it from happening again. There's a lawyer who volunteers, sometimes explains the fine print. It's practical stuff." I nodded slowly. Practical sounded safe. She leaned her elbows on her knees. "I think you'd like it. It's not about bitterness, it's about reclaiming control. Some of us just need to remember that saying no isn't the same as being cruel." Her words sat between us like a small truth waiting to be picked up. I thought of Julian's neat stack of papers, Vanessa's sharp tone, Ethan's eyes avoiding mine. Saying no had felt cold at first, but now, under this pale light, it felt necessary. "When's the next meeting?" I asked. "Tomorrow afternoon, community center by the harbor. There's coffee and way too many cookies. Come if you feel like it, no pressure." "I'll think about it," I said. She smiled again and stood. "That's a start. Sometimes thinking about it is the hardest part." After she left, I sat for a while longer. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of salt from the water. The pile of cut lavender lay by my feet, colorless and light. I gathered it in my hands and walked to the garbage bin near the fence. For a second, I almost stopped, tempted to keep it for the sake of what it once meant. But memory, I realized, can weigh more than it's worth. I tossed the bundle in, and as it fell, a few petals broke loose and drifted on the breeze. Inside the house, I washed my hands, the scent of lavender lingering faintly on my skin. I made another cup of coffee and carried it to the living room. The place was still, the air clear. I sat down by the window and watched the garden. The cut stems looked bare but clean, as if waiting for something new to grow. George had always been the one who planted things. I had been the one who kept them alive. Now, for the first time, I wanted to start over, not maintain what used to be. That afternoon, I pulled out a notebook and wrote Grace's name on the first page, followed by Silver Harbor Network. I added the time and address she mentioned, underlining them once. The act of writing it down made it real. I didn't know if I was ready to talk, but I was ready to listen. As the sun dropped lower, the air carried a faint coolness. I went outside once more, gathered the tools, and looked at the lavender roots. They were still firm, still alive under the soil. I pressed the dirt around them gently. Growth, I thought, always starts hidden. When I came back inside, the faint hum of the refrigerator greeted me again. The house no longer felt as heavy. I poured myself another small cup of coffee, still warm from the pot. In the reflection of the window, I saw a woman standing straight, her shoulders not slumped, but steady. The garden behind her was half empty, half ready. Some things have to be cut back before they can grow again. The next afternoon was bright and windless, the kind of rare Seattle day that made the harbor shimmer like glass. I almost didn't go. The thought of sitting in a room full of strangers talking about mistakes felt like standing under a light I wasn't ready for. But by 1 o'clock, I found myself parking outside the community center, clutching my notebook as if it were a shield. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. A few women sat in folding chairs arranged in a circle. They greeted me with small smiles, the kind that said welcome without asking questions. Grace waved from the far side of the room, her scarf bright against the gray walls. She patted the seat beside her. "Glad you made it," she said softly. At the front stood a woman with sharp glasses and a kind smile. I learned her name was Clara Jensen, a lawyer who volunteered with the group. She couldn't have been older than 30, but she carried herself like someone used to being heard. On the whiteboard behind her were the words power of attorney and financial safety. When everyone settled, Clara began. Most of the women had coffee cups in their hands, some balancing cookies on napkins. She introduced herself and said she wanted to share a few real stories before we talked about prevention. One of the women, gray-haired and thin, raised her hand. She said her name was Renee. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were clear. She told us how her son had forged her signature on an insurance document to cash out a policy she didn't even remember buying. She found out when the company called about the tax form. She said she forgave him because that's what mothers do, but forgiveness didn't bring the money back. No one interrupted. Some nodded slowly, understanding without needing details. Clara thanked her, then began to draw lines and arrows on the whiteboard, explaining the power of attorney. She broke it down, simply showing how one signature could hand over control of everything, accounts, property, even medical decisions. She circled the words durable and irrevocable, explaining how those terms had been used to trap vulnerable people. As she spoke, my chest tightened. She held up a sample form, the same structure, the same language. Durable power of attorney. The fonts were different, but the layout was identical to the papers Julian had laid on my table. My fingers went cold. I could almost hear his voice again, calm and confident. "Just sign here." I must have stopped breathing for a second because Grace touched my elbow. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. Clara went on explaining how to revoke existing authorizations, how to set up a protective order if anyone tried to exploit or intimidate an elder for financial gain. The words protective order sounded both foreign and powerful. After the presentation, people mingled, sharing quiet stories. Someone laughed softly about how her daughter had once borrowed her credit card for a yoga retreat. Another woman described changing her locks after her niece moved out. There was no judgment in the room, only a collective tired wisdom. Grace motioned for me to follow her to a table by the window, where a woman in a gray blazer was writing notes in a small folder. Her hair was tied back, her expression both calm and alert. "Helen, this is Detective Naomi Holt," Grace said. "She handles financial abuse cases for King County." Naomi stood and shook my hand firmly. "Nice to meet you." Grace told me a little about what happened. "Would you like to talk privately?" We moved to a quieter corner. She opened her folder and took out a simple form. "Tell me what's been going on," she said. I started from the beginning, the bank visit, the blocked accounts, the uninvited visit, the paper on my table. I described Julian, his words, Vanessa's anger, Ethan's silence. Naomi listened without interrupting, her pen moving occasionally but never too fast. When I mentioned recording the encounter, she looked up. "You still have the video?" "Yes, on my phone." "Good," she said. "That helps." We can document that as evidence of coercion. She explained how the protective order worked, that it wasn't about punishing anyone, but setting a boundary recognized by law. It would protect my financial and physical space, giving the police authority to intervene if there were more visits or harassment. I hesitated, looking down at my hands. It felt heavy, like crossing a line I'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Naomi must have sensed it. She said quietly, "Protecting yourself isn't selfish, Helen. It's a right. And sometimes it's the only way to keep the people you love accountable." Her words settled in slowly, steady and grounding. I nodded. She handed me a pen and pointed to the bottom of the form. "When you're ready, sign there." My hand trembled slightly as I wrote my name. The ink looked darker than usual. For a second, I thought of all the signatures that had come before: checks, permission slips, mortgage renewals, marriage papers. Every one of them had been for someone else, for something shared. This one was different. This one was mine. Naomi took the paper and placed it in her folder. "I'll file this today," she said. "You'll get confirmation in a few days. If anyone contacts or pressures you, call me directly." Grace appeared beside us, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You did it," she said gently, handing one to me. I smiled faintly. It felt small but real. Clara stopped by before I left and gave me a packet of resources pamphlets about financial autonomy community support numbers and a checklist for protecting digital accounts. I tucked it into my bag. Outside, the sky had turned soft blue, the water in the harbor rippling with light. The air smelled faintly of salt and exhaust. I stood there a long time, breathing it in. When I finally got home, I placed the packet and Naomi's card on the kitchen table beside my ledger. The papers looked out of place among the coffee stains and notes, but they belonged there now. I made a cup of tea and carried it to the window. The lavender roots sat quiet under the soil, trimmed and waiting. I picked up the pen from the counter, twirled it once in my hand, and smiled at how something so small could change everything. For the first time in years, my signature wasn't for someone else. It was for me. That night, the rain came back hard, pelting against the windows like 1,000 small knocks. I had left the porch light on, out of habit, the soft amber glow spilling across the front steps. I was half asleep on the couch when my phone vibrated. The notification from the door camera appeared on the screen. Motion detected. I tapped it open. The image flickered in the dim light, blurred by the rain. A figure stood on the porch, head down, coat dripping. In his hand was a bouquet of flowers wrapped in wet paper and a small envelope pressed against his chest. Behind him, a car idled at the curb. I recognized Vanessa in the driver's seat, her face faintly lit by the headlights. Ethan lifted his head toward the camera. His voice was barely audible through the speaker. "Mom, I just want to talk. I just want to explain." He looked up at the door for a long time, waiting. The sound of rain filled the silence between his words. I watched him shift the flowers from one hand to the other, his shoulders sinking. Then he stepped back, hesitated, and finally turned toward the car. The headlights brightened, then moved away down the street until the sound of the engine faded. I didn't move. I sat there staring at the screen until it dimmed. My hand hovered over the phone, then I locked it and set it down. Some explanations come too late to matter. By morning, the rain had slowed to a mist. I made coffee and noticed the lavender outside looked trampled near the fence. The gate was crooked, one hinge bent slightly. When I stepped closer, I saw footprints pressed into the mud too large to be Grace's. My phone rang. It was Naomi. Her voice was calm but firm. "I got a notice from patrol last night," she said. "Someone reported a vehicle circling your block after midnight. Did you see anything unusual?" I told her about the camera footage and the broken fence. She asked me to forward the video and said she'd file it as a harassment report for now. I could hear her typing in the background. "I'll log this under your protective order," she said. "If they come back, call me immediately." After the call, I walked the perimeter of the yard. The lavender stems were crushed flat. The damp soil marked where someone had stepped too close. I straightened what I could, then went back inside. The quiet of the house felt heavier than usual. By noon, the mail arrived. A thick envelope from the Homeowners Association sat on top of the pile. The letter inside was printed on official letterhead: violation notice, unauthorized landscape alteration, failure to submit maintenance form prior to cutting or removal of vegetation. I laughed softly. It sounded almost absurd after everything else. Beverly Klein, the HOA president, had been looking for a reason to remind me of the rules since George died. When Grace came by later, I handed her the letter. She read it, eyebrows arching. They're citing you for cutting your own lavender, apparently, I said. She glanced toward the yard, then back at me. You know what this smells like, someone trying to make your life harder, Vanessa, I said quietly. Grace nodded. She's always had a talent for making trouble look like concern. The HOA hearing was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Grace insisted on coming with me. You'll want a witness, she said. They'll try to rattle you. The meeting was held in the community room at the clubhouse. Folding chairs, fluorescent lights, coffee urns that smelled burnt. Beverly sat at the center of the long table, her glasses perched low on her nose, a clipboard full of notes in front of her. Mrs. Whitmore, she began using the same tone she might use with a child. We received a report that you altered landscaping on your property without prior approval. You were issued a fine of $200. I kept my hands folded on the table. I didn't alter anything. I trimmed lavender plants that were within my property line. She pursed her lips. According to the report, the plants were removed, not trimmed. That qualifies as a violation. Grace leaned forward slightly. Section 8.4 of the HOA bylaws allows residents to maintain, prune, or remove vegetation within their property boundaries. I read it this morning. Beverly's expression tightened. I'm aware of the section, she said. However, complaints were filed. I took out my phone and opened the video Naomi had saved for me. The screen showed the timestamp, the rain, the footprints. I pressed play. Ethan's figure appeared briefly at the gate, the lavender crushed beneath his shoes. Beverly frowned. What is this supposed to prove? That the damage you're citing wasn't done by me, I said evenly, and that I have the right to protect my own property from anyone who shows up uninvited. The room went still. One of the board members cleared his throat but said nothing. Beverly glanced toward the others, then back at me. We'll review the footage, she said, finally her voice smaller. For now, we'll waive the fine pending further discussion. No further discussion is necessary, I replied. The footage is time-stamped and the law is clear. Grace smiled faintly beside me. As we stood to leave, Beverly adjusted her glasses, her voice softer now. You could have just called me about this. Helen. I paused by the door. I tried calling for years, Beverly. No one ever listened. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The pavement glistened like glass under the weak afternoon sun. I took a slow breath, the air clean and cool. Grace squeezed my arm. You handled that perfectly. I just stayed within the lines I said, the ones they thought I'd forgotten. We walked to the parking lot in silence. The clouds were breaking apart over the water strips of pale blue showing through. For the first time in days, I felt something light in my chest, not joy exactly, but steadiness. When I got home, I stood at the window again. The lavender was bent but not broken. I knelt and tied the stems loosely with twine to help them stand. They leaned, but they held. Inside the house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. The reflection in the glass caught my eye again, smaller than I used to be maybe, but straight and certain. I don't need to raise my voice to be heard. I only need to be right. The week after the HOA meeting was unusually quiet. The rain had eased the air sharp with the scent of wet cedar. I spent most mornings trimming the lavender, wiping down the porch, and letting silence fill the space that once made me uneasy. Grace stopped by one evening with her usual knock, carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. For you, she said, setting it on the table. Found this while cleaning my attic. It looked like something you'd appreciate. Inside was an old cassette tape in a cracked plastic case. The label was faded, but I could just make out George's handwriting. August 2009. He had used that old tape recorder during his short-lived project of documenting memories for Ethan. He'd given up after 3 tapes, saying he preferred living stories to recording them. I didn't have a cassette player anymore, but Grace being Grace had thought of everything. She handed me a small black player, the kind that clicked loudly when you pressed play. I sat on the couch, hands trembling just a little as I fed the tape into the slot. The player hummed, and then his voice filled the room, grainy but unmistakably his. If they ever make you doubt your worth, remember I always believed in it. The sound of his breath, a faint laugh afterward, the scrape of the chair he used to sit in near the window. Then silence. My throat tightened. The years between then and now folded together like pages pressed too close. I hadn't heard his voice since the night I whispered goodbye in the hospital. I closed my eyes, listening again. The recording ended abruptly, the click echoing through the living room. Grace sat quietly across from me, her eyes kind. You okay? I nodded, wiping my cheek. Yes, I just forgot what his voice sounded like when he wasn't sick. Keep it, she said softly. Maybe it came back for a reason. After she left, I sat by the window with the cassette still running in my mind. The street was slick with rain again, lights from passing cars stretching into gold lines across the pavement. I thought of how easily voices fade when no one repeats their words. That night, I wrote. I opened a blank document and let the words come out uneven at first, then faster. I wrote about the bank, the paper on the table, the way silence can be a form of survival. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I titled it Stop Buying Affection and sent it to the Silver Harbor group with a short note for anyone who's ever been made to feel that love has a price tag. By morning, there were a dozen replies, women thanking me, sharing their own small stories. Someone asked to post it on the community blog. I said yes, thinking maybe a few people would read it. Within days, the views climbed. Then a local magazine picked it up under the headline, Elder Voices Stories of Financial Courage. Grace called that afternoon, her voice practically glowing through the phone. Helen, you're trending on Facebook, she said, laughing. You're famous now. I smiled, though part of me was uneasy. I hadn't written it for attention. I'd written it because I needed air. 2 nights later, I got the email. The subject line was formal, but the tone underneath was sharp. It was from Vanessa. She accused me of defamation, claimed the article was a personal attack, that my false narrative had damaged her brand. She demanded I take it down within 24 hours or face legal consequences. The message ended with a threat disguised as professionalism. I know how to handle reputation management, Helen. I read it twice, then a third time. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, I considered replying. Then I remembered Naomi's advice. Do not engage with anyone trying to intimidate you. Keep records, not arguments. I forwarded the message to Grace, who showed up the next morning with her laptop. She had a friend who worked in IT at the city library. Together, over coffee, they traced the metadata. Vanessa had sent it from her influencer management account, not her personal one. That alone made it clear she had intended it as a professional threat. Grace's friend saved everything onto a flash drive documenting timestamps, IP address, and embedded links. Evidence, he said, sliding the drive across the table. Keep it safe. That night, I opened the cassette player again and let George's voice fill the room. If they ever make you doubt your worth, remember, I always believed in it, I whispered back, almost smiling. I'm starting to believe it too. I watched the rain through the window, each drop catching the porch light before disappearing into the dark. I thought about how easily people rewrite stories to fit their comfort. Vanessa wanted the world to see her as a victim of my bitterness, not the architect of her own greed. But truth, I was learning, doesn't need to shout. It just waits. I closed my laptop and turned off the lights, leaving only the glow from the window. The lavender outside swayed under the rain, thin but standing. I leaned against the frame, feeling the faint hum of the cassette still playing in my mind. I didn't write to take revenge. I wrote so women like me would know they weren't invisible. Outside, a car passed its headlights, sweeping across the wet street like a moving reminder that the world keeps going, with or without permission. I took a deep breath and pressed my palm to the glass. The reflection staring back at me didn't look like someone's mother or widow or target, just a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for being right. The rain softened into a mist again. Somewhere far away, the faint echo of George's laugh lingered like the tail end of a song. I don't write to hurt anyone, I whispered into the quiet. I write to give back a voice to those who were never heard. Spring arrived late that year, soft and hesitant, as if the city itself wasn't ready to warm up. I was at the kitchen table sorting mail when the phone rang. It was Naomi. Her tone was calm, but beneath it I could hear something sharper, the kind of steadiness that comes before a storm. Helen, she said, we got a call from North River Credit Union. Their auditor flagged something suspicious. A man named Andrew Kim reached out to me directly. You might want to sit down. I stayed where I was. I had learned by then that sitting didn't make hard things easier. Naomi continued. It looks like Julian Reed used your Social Security number to file multiple tax returns over the last 2 years. There are deposits tied to accounts under his name. The IRS is opening an investigation. For a moment, I couldn't find words. The air in the kitchen felt heavier pressing against my ribs. I gripped the edge of the table. So he really did it, I said finally. Yes, and Vanessa may have helped. We found a shared digital signature between their filings. She told me not to worry, that I wouldn't be held liable. They already had the paperwork I'd filed with her months ago. My protective order, the bank alerts, everything lined up like proof waiting for light. When we hung up, I stared at the lavender outside. It had started to bloom again, the new buds soft and defiant against the cold wind. 2 weeks earlier, I'd had to face a different kind of confrontation. The HOA hearing had been rescheduled officially, this time with the board and community members present. I didn't want to go, but Grace insisted. The room smelled of coffee and damp carpet, and Beverly Klein looked smaller behind the long wooden table than she had the last time. Before she could start her usual speech about regulations, I stood. I brought the same folder as before, with video evidence, Naomi's contact, and the bylaws printed out in large highlighted text. I didn't raise my voice. I just laid it all out. By the time I finished, Beverly's hands were shaking slightly. She cleared her throat, removed her glasses, and said the words I had not expected. "Mrs. Whitmore, it appears we made an error in judgment. We apologize for the misunderstanding." I nodded once. Grace squeezed my hand. The other board members avoided my eyes, pretending to study their notes. As I turned to leave, I could hear Beverly mutter something about rules and neighbors and lessons learned. But none of that mattered. For the first time in years, I walked out of that room without feeling small. Outside, a few women from the Silver Harbor Network were waiting, clapping softly as if we'd just finished a trial instead of a meeting. Clara handed me a cup of tea from the vending machine. "You were incredible," she said. "Calm always wins." Maybe I said, smiling a little, but sometimes calm just hides the fire. That afternoon, while driving home, I saw Ethan's car parked by the curb near my house. For a moment, I thought about driving past, pretending not to see him, but I stopped. He stood by the mailbox holding an envelope, his hair uncombed, his face pale. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly as I stepped out. I didn't answer, waiting for him to speak first. He held out the envelope. "This is for you." Inside was a letter in his handwriting, the kind he used to send from college when he still believed letters mattered. Next to it was a printed email highlighted in yellow. The sender was Vanessa, the subject line short and incriminating. "We can use her SSN. She'll never know." I looked at him. "You found this." He nodded. "I went through her computer after I saw your article. She said it was nothing but I knew. I've been helping Naomi gather everything." For a moment I saw the boy he used to be standing there, with scraped knees and apologies that didn't need words. His voice broke slightly. "I let them drag me too far, Mom. I thought I was helping her, that it was just paperwork. I was wrong." I folded the letter carefully, my fingers steady. "No one can fix your mistakes for you, Ethan. But knowing where you went wrong is how you start growing up." He nodded again, eyes wet but clear. "I'm trying." He left quietly, shoulders lighter than when he arrived. When his car turned the corner, I stood there for a long time, the wind brushing against my coat. A few days later, Naomi called again. Her voice this time carried a hint of relief. "Helen, the IRS just confirmed. Vanessa Reed and Julian Reed have been charged with tax fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. The evidence was overwhelming. They'll be arraigned next week." I thanked her, though the words felt small against the weight of it all. She paused, then said, "You did everything right. Most people freeze. You fought back." After the call, I went to the small cafe near the harbor, the one where George and I used to stop after Sunday walks. The place hadn't changed much. The same chipped mugs, the same faint smell of cinnamon and rain. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee and stared at the muted television above the counter. The local news anchor spoke over footage of 2 people being escorted from a courthouse, hands cuffed, faces hidden under umbrellas. The caption read, "Reed siblings indicted in federal tax fraud case." No one in the cafe seemed to care. A man flipped through his newspaper. A woman laughed softly into her phone. The world went on. I watched until the screen shifted to a weather report. My reflection in the glass looked calm, older, but unbroken. Justice doesn't roar, I thought. It whispers, and you have to be quiet enough to hear it. Outside, the clouds had begun to part, streaks of sunlight cutting through the gray. I took a sip of my coffee, now lukewarm, and let the warmth spread through my hands. When I left the cafe, the air smelled of salt and something new. The sound of the harbor was steady waves brushing against the docks like a soft applause. I walked slowly toward my car, the envelope from Ethan tucked safely in my coat pocket. There was no triumph in me, no rush of victory, just a deep, still breath, the kind that feels like finally setting something down after carrying it too far. Justice, I realize, doesn't need applause. It only needs someone willing to say enough. By the time spring returned, the lavender in the pots had started to bloom again, pale purple against the silver railing of my new balcony. I had sold the house on Maple Street in late winter, signing the papers with the same pen I used for the protective order months earlier. There was no ceremony, no regret, just quiet relief. The apartment near Lake Union was smaller, brighter, and easier to breathe in. Most mornings I sat by the window with coffee watching rowers cut through the water in perfect rhythm. The city sounded different here, lighter somehow. Grace stopped by, often carrying her usual energy in a paper bag filled with croissants and gossip. "You actually did it," she said that first morning, setting down the bag. "You moved," I smiled, finally. She looked around approvingly. "It suits you. Clean, quiet, but not lonely." I laughed. "That's a polite way of saying it looks like a widow's nest." She shook her head. "No, it looks like peace." We sat on the balcony while she poured coffee from her thermos. The air smelled like rain and coffee beans. She reached into her bag again and pulled out a small basket wrapped in brown paper. Inside were lavender clippings tied with twine. "For your new beginning," she said. I touched the soft petals still damp from the morning. "Thank you, Grace, for everything." She waved her hand. "Don't get sentimental on me. Just promise you'll let these grow wild. No trimming for symmetry." After she left, I placed the basket beside the window and looked out at the lake again. Sunlight shimmered on the surface, tiny ripples catching light like scattered coins. For once, I didn't feel like counting anything. That afternoon, a letter arrived, handwritten, the return address familiar. I carried it to the table before opening it. Ethan's handwriting was steadier than before, slower, as if each word carried weight. "Mom, thank you for not giving up on what's right. I'm starting over. I know I can't fix everything, but I'm trying. I hope someday you'll let me visit. I planted lavender in our yard. Thought you'd like that." I read it twice, then folded it and set it beside the cracked white mug George had bought me years ago. The chip on the rim caught the light. I hadn't used it in months, but I never threw it away. Some things aren't meant to be replaced, only repurposed. The rain began again, light and steady, streaking the glass. I took a sip of coffee and felt something shift inside me, something small but certain. For years I'd measured my worth by how much I gave away, how much I could hold without breaking. I thought love was proof of goodness, that forgiveness made me strong. But maybe strength was quieter than that. Maybe it was just staying whole when the world kept asking you to split yourself in half. I walked to the balcony and leaned on the railing. Below, a couple walked hand in hand along the waterfront, their laughter carried by the wind. Across the lake, the city lights began to flicker to life. I watched them blur through the mist like a painting still wet. Somewhere behind me, the old cassette still sat on the shelf, the one with George's voice. I hadn't played it again since that night. I didn't need to. His words had already settled where they were meant to stay. "If they ever make you doubt your worth, remember, I always believed in it." I whispered back into the quiet I remember. The lavender swayed lightly, the purple heads turning toward the rain. I thought of all the versions of myself. I had been the wife keeping books at the hospital, the mother wiring money, the woman standing at her own door while her son begged outside it. Each version had carried me here. Outside, the rain softened into a fine mist, blurring the line between water and air. I closed my eyes and let the cool wind brush against my face. They erased my name from the invitation once. I thought that meant I had disappeared, but that was the day I began writing my name again. I turned off the lights, letting the room rest in the soft, gray glow of the evening. The lavender filled the air with its quiet scent. Some endings, I thought, don't close anything. They just clear the page for what comes next. If someone ever makes you feel you're not special enough to be invited, remember this. The invitation was never the proof. You are.